The wind was dry that morning, the kind that sifts through your bones and makes the world feel like it's crumbling into dust. Elijah was fixing a busted hinge on the feed shed door when he heard it. A rustle, too careful to be the wind, and too soft to be a raccoon. He kept his hammer low and crept around the side of the shed. That's when he saw her. She was no more than 9 years old, rail-thin, with dirt on her cheeks and dried blood on her elbow. A worn shawl hung from her shoulders, threadbare and barely clinging. She froze mid-scoop, her small hands inside his oat sack, caught between hunger and fear. Her dark eyes met his, wide and alert, like a deer cornered in tall grass. Elijah didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't shout. He just stared back, feeling something ancient stir in his gut. A memory of the sister he buried at 10, the same sunken cheeks, the same shaking hands. "You hungry?" he asked. The girl blinked once, slow. She didn't nod, didn't move, just stood there, with her fingers buried in grain, like letting go might mean she'd vanish. He took a step forward, careful not to spook her. "You eat that raw, you'll get sick." He pointed toward the house. "Got stew left from last night. Beans, maybe a bit of pork if the dog didn't get it first." Still no answer, but she dropped the oats. By the time he ladled warm broth into a dented tin cup, she was sitting on the edge of the porch like she'd always belonged there. She took the stew in silence, held it with both hands, and sipped so slow it near broke his heart. Elijah didn't speak again. Not until the cup was empty, and her shoulders had dropped just enough to look like she might sleep sitting up. "What's your name?" The wind carried the question away. But after a long pause, she whispered it like it was a secret she barely remembered. "Tala." Elijah nodded. No smile, just a small flicker of understanding behind tired eyes. He didn't ask where she'd come from or what happened to the folks who should have been keeping her safe. He just brought out a blanket and sat beside her on the porch as the last of the morning light crept over the hills. Something told him the world behind her was burning, and something worse might be following close behind. But for now, she was warm and fed and still breathing, and sometimes out here, that was enough. Elijah saddled his mare before sunrise. He didn't sleep much that night, not with the girl curled up in the corner of his barn like a wounded animal, and not with the thought gnawing at his brain like rats in the walls. Something had brought her here. Something bad enough to send a child alone into the desert. And if it had teeth, it might come looking. The trail was faint but fresh. Tiny prints in the dust heading northeast, weaving through mesquite like a snake avoiding hawks. Elijah followed them slow, eyes sharp, rifle resting across his saddle horn. After 2 miles, the tracks met wagon ruts. 3 sets, shallow and scattered, like someone had tried to steer wide of the road. He kept going until the smell hit him. Burnt wood, burnt leather, burnt meat. He crested a ridge and saw what was left. A caravan, or what used to be one, lay twisted in the arroyo below. 3 wagons, blackened and gutted. Wheels charred down to the spokes. No horses, no bodies, just ashes and blood. And silence. That bone-deep kind of silence that doesn't come from nature. It comes from something that took nature and tore it apart. Elijah dismounted, rifle up, every step deliberate. He circled the first wagon, eyes scanning for signs of life or death. There were none. No footprints, no drag marks, no arrows. just scorch marks and one broken doll's arm half buried in the soot. Someone had taken care to erase the story. But Elijah had seen enough raids in his time to know this wasn't one. He knelt near the second wagon and found it, the edge of a boot heel, small military issue pressed into the ash. Too clean, too exact. Indian raids didn't leave boots behind. They didn't use fire like this, and they sure as hell didn't vanish every trace of the dead. This was something else. A message. He stood slowly, looking out across the blackened trail, his throat tight. The wind picked up, stirring the ashes like ghosts. He thought of Tala back at the ranch, alone, wrapped in a quilt too big for her bones. He thought of the way she hadn't flinched when he handed her food, but had jumped when he lit the fire. Whoever did this had left no bodies, because the bodies told a story. Whoever did this had made sure only one witness escaped, and now she was on his land, eating his food, sleeping under his roof. He mounted up without looking back. There was no point burying what wasn't there. But as he rode home, he felt the heat of the burned wagons still clinging to his clothes. And he knew, deep in the pit of his gut, that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She was still on the porch when Elijah returned, knees pulled to her chest, the empty stewed tin beside her like a keepsake. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, and her eyes, half open, half watching, followed him as he dismounted. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The smell of burnt wood still clung to his coat like guilt, and when he stepped onto the porch, her nose twitched, her hands balled into fists. Ash clung to her hair. Not fresh, not from his coat. It had been there all along, worked into the strands like soot in a chimney. He hadn't noticed last night, too focused on the shape of her bones under that shawl, on the way her fingers trembled holding the tin. But now he saw it clear as daylight. The blackened streaks near her scalp, the faint, acrid smell beneath the dirt. She'd been close when it burned, close enough to carry it with her. He crouched in front of her, arms resting on his knees, and studied her face. Her eyes were sharper now, less dazed, like something behind them had started to wake. "Was that your caravan?" She didn't answer. "Your people?" She didn't blink. He took a breath. "I found what's left of it. No one else there. Just ashes." A muscle in her jaw jumped. Still no words, but her bottom lip started to tremble, and she pressed it tight between her teeth like she was trying to kill the feeling before it could escape. Elijah didn't push. Instead, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and dipped it in the bucket by the door. Then he sat beside her and gently reached for her hair. She flinched, just once, but didn't pull away. He worked in silence, brushing the ash free one stroke at a time. His hands were calloused, better suited to mending fence posts than touching something so fragile. But he was careful, tender, the way you'd clean a relic from a grave. It took nearly 15 minutes. When he finished, the shawl was dark with soot, and the wind carried tiny black flakes across the porch floor. He set the handkerchief aside and looked at her again. "You don't have to tell me what happened. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you're safe here. Long as you want to be." She didn't nod, didn't move. But she reached out, just slightly, and let her hand rest against the edge of his coat. Not holding, just touching, like she needed to be sure he was real. Elijah said nothing. He just watched the horizon, the same way he always did when storms were coming. Only this time, the storm had a face. A girl with ashes in her hair and a secret too big for words. Elijah knew trouble by the way dust moved. This wasn't wind or cattle. This was riders, 3 of them, coming slow over the southern ridge, casting long shadows against the dying sun. They weren't in a hurry, which meant they weren't lost. They knew where they were going, and they wanted to be seen. He laid a hand on the rifle resting by the porch rail, then glanced behind him. Tala was asleep in the barn loft, curled up in the hay like a bird in a nest. He'd checked on her an hour ago, tucked a blanket over her thin shoulders, and told himself she'd be safe. Now he wasn't so sure. The riders came into focus as they crossed the yard. Men dressed like traders, clean coats, polished boots, but with the stiffness of soldiers under their civility. One had a Union pistol holstered backwards on his hip, the kind worn by men who drew fast and meant to kill. Another had a ledger strapped to his saddle like it was worth more than gold. Elijah didn't like any of it. "Evening," one of them called, pulling his horse to a halt near the porch. Friendly tone, empty smile. "You Elijah Briggs?" "That's right." The man tipped his hat. "Heard you keep to yourself out here. That's still true?" Elijah didn't answer, just let the silence stretch. The man's smile didn't falter, but the ledger writer scribbled something on a page, eyes flicking toward the barn. "We're looking for someone," the first man continued. "Young girl. Might have wandered off a caravan that passed through these parts. Slim thing, dark hair, maybe hungry." Elijah's jaw tightened. "I see a lot of hungry things. Mostly coyotes." The man laughed, but it was dry, perfunctory. "Well, if you happen to spot one that walks on 2 legs and don't speak much, we'd appreciate the word. Can't have kids running wild out here. Dangerous country." "Sure is," Elijah said, resting a hand casually on the porch rail. "All kinds of danger." For a moment, the rider said nothing. The ledger man closed his book. The one with the pistol adjusted his coat. Elijah could feel them sizing him up, calculating risk. Finally, the leader nodded. "You see anything, let the marshal at Fort Calhoun know. He's mighty interested in finding this one. I'll keep my eyes open." They rode off slow, not looking back. Just enough to let you know they didn't need to. Elijah didn't move until the dust settled. Then he turned and went straight to the barn. Climbing the ladder to the loft, he found Tala awake, eyes wide, body rigid. "They asked about you," he said quietly. "Didn't say your name, but they knew you." She nodded once, so faint he almost missed it. Then she whispered something that made the hair on his neck stand up. "They killed everyone." The fire cracked low in the hearth, more embers than flame now. Elijah sat at the edge of his chair, rubbing a thumb across the rim of his coffee tin, watching the girl across from him. She hadn't moved much since she'd whispered those words. They killed everyone. 4 syllables that stripped the room of heat and made the night outside feel closer than it should have been. Tala sat tucked in the corner near the stove, knees drawn to her chest, blanket wrapped tight around her, like she was holding herself together with cloth and breath. She hadn't eaten since midday, just stared at the fire like it might speak if she stared hard enough. Elijah didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that pain had its own clock. He thought about those riders, the way they smiled with their teeth and not their eyes. thought about the boots by the burned wagons, and the silence that felt too rehearsed. And for the first time in years, something stirred inside him that he thought had long since gone cold. Anger. Not the kind that exploded, but the slow kind. The kind that simmered low and steady. The kind that turned good men into killers when the right line got crossed. He leaned back and took a long sip of coffee, bitter and strong. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to tell ghost stories out on the trail. Back when I was younger. Meaner. Ones about haunted mines and Comanche spirits that screamed at night." Tala didn't respond, but he saw her eyes flick up for a second. "But the worst ghosts," he continued, "ain't out there in the desert. They're the ones you carry. The ones you tried to leave behind, but keep showing up in your sleep." He let that sit for a moment. Then, "There was a boy once, about your age, years back. Bandits hit a ranch outside Santa Rosa. I got there too late. Place was already burning. Found the boy hiding under a wagon. Didn't say a word, just clung to my coat and shook." Tala's grip on the blanket tightened. "I left him with a doctor in town. Thought he'd be safer there. A week later, the boy disappeared. Doc said he ran off. Folks said maybe he'd gone back to find his family. But I knew better." Elijah's voice dropped to a whisper. "They came looking. Just like they're looking for you." Tala looked up at him fully now. Her eyes weren't scared. They were hollow, like someone too young to bury the dead, but old enough to remember where they fell. Elijah reached forward, gently placed his hand on the floor beside her. Not touching, just near enough to feel. "I didn't save that boy. I won't make the same mistake twice." Outside, the coyotes howled somewhere near the tree line, but neither of them flinched. Not anymore. The next morning came heavy and gray, a pale sun struggling to rise through a veil of low clouds. Elijah stepped out with his coffee in one hand and his rifle in the other. Something felt wrong. Not loud wrong, quiet wrong. The kind of wrong that settles under your skin before you know why. The yard was still, no wind, no birds. Even the hens clucked low, restless in their coop. Elijah scanned the horizon, then the barn, then the fence line. All in place. Nothing moved. But when he rounded the corner to check the feed shed, he saw them. Footprints, not his, not Tala's. 4 sets, boots, heavy, wide tread, made no more than a few hours ago. They circled the barn, stopped near the porch, then disappeared back into the desert. No horses, just boots, walking. Elijah crouched low, ran his hand along the imprint nearest the door. The dirt was still compressed, not yet lifted by the morning breeze. 1 step more to the left, and it would have creaked against the warped porch board that groaned if you looked at it wrong. They'd come close, real close. Close enough to hear breathing through the wall. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing, the air around him sharper now. He scanned the horizon again, not for riders, but for glints. A lens, a barrel, a mistake. Nothing. He went inside and found Tala sitting on the floor near the stove, wrapped in the same blanket, her hair still matted from sleep. But she was awake, watching the door. "They came last night," he said. No question in it. She nodded. "You see them?" She shook her head. "Heard them. One spoke in English. One didn't." Elijah didn't ask what the other one spoke. He didn't want to know yet. He pulled the old trunk from beneath his bed and opened it for the first time in 5 years. Inside were 2 boxes of shells, a tin of grease, and a pistol he hadn't touched since the last time lawmen came with smiles and lies. He loaded it slow, careful not to let his hands shake in front of her. By sundown, every window in the house had been shuttered, the barn door barred, and the lanterns turned down low. He sat in his chair by the stove, rifle resting across his lap, eyes on the door. Tala slept again, but this time in the corner behind the kitchen table, hidden from view. She didn't ask to be there. She just moved, instinctive as a deer who knows the sound of a snapping twig too well. Elijah didn't sleep at all. The moon rose cold over the plains, silver light cutting through the boards. Somewhere out in that darkness were men who'd walked onto his land with silent boots and careful eyes. Men looking for a child they hadn't finished killing. And Elijah knew if they came again, they wouldn't leave footprints behind. He showed up just after noon, riding a gray gelding too well-fed for frontier work. Elijah spotted him from the barn roof, where he was patching a hole the crows had picked at all spring. One man, alone, but he didn't ride like he was worried. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders back, and a long-barreled revolver tied to his thigh like a promise. Marshal Kincaid. Elijah hadn't seen him in years, not since the Dry Creek incident, where 4 men died without a single shot fired by the law. Kincaid was the kind of man who wore a badge, like it gave him permission to smile while pulling a trigger. He didn't chase justice. He sold it. The marshal reined in at the fence, then swung down slow, letting his spurs jingle loud enough to announce himself twice. Elijah climbed down from the roof, wiped the sweat from his brow, and met him halfway across the yard. "Elijah Briggs," Kincaid said, tipping his hat just enough to mock respect. "Didn't figure I'd find you still breathing out here." "Turns out I'm hard to kill," Elijah replied. Kincaid chuckled, then looked around. "Heard you've been keeping company lately. A little girl. Real quiet type." "I don't keep company," Elijah said. "And I sure as hell don't keep children." Kincaid's smile faded just a shade. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded document. "Official warrant," he said, tapping it once, "for the apprehension of a tribal fugitive. Claims vary: espionage, theft, murder. She's wanted at Fort Calhoun. Alive preferred. Dead acceptable." Elijah didn't reach for it. "Now," Kincaid said, voice lowering, "I know you. You ain't one of those fool saints that dies for a cause. You want quiet, a roof that don't leak, maybe even a couple acres to retire on. I could help with that. Real easy. Just point me to the girl, and we both walk away winners." Elijah stared at him for a long time. The wind kicked up, rustling the dry grass. "And if I don't?" Kincaid shrugged. "Then I come back with 20 men and burn this place down looking, and no court in the territory will blink." Elijah stepped closer, close enough to smell whiskey on the marshal's breath. "You listen to me real careful. If you or your dogs step 1 foot past my fence again, I'll bury every last one of you beneath it." Kincaid held his stare for a beat, then smiled, slow and cruel. "Should have known you'd choose the hard way, Briggs. You always did have a soft spot for lost causes." He mounted up without another word and rode off without looking back. Elijah stood in the dirt, jaw clenched, fists shaking. Inside the barn, Tala was watching from the shadows. And she knew. So did he. The war had just begun. The rain came late that night, soft and steady, soaking into the thirsty earth like an apology. Elijah sat at the edge of his porch, rifle across his knees, boots in the mud, watching the water pool in the cracks between his fence posts. Behind him, the house was dark, lamps snuffed, windows boarded, and still he felt watched. Tala hadn't spoken since Kincaid rode off, not even a whisper. She stayed tucked in the barn, crouched in the hay, like she was bracing for the world to come crashing down. Elijah brought her food and blankets, but she barely touched either. He'd seen men go silent like that after a battle, shells of themselves, too hollow to hold grief. He finally stepped inside, soaked to the skin, and found her exactly where he'd left her. Same blanket, same eyes, wide and waiting. He crouched in front of her, dripping rain onto the hay, and set down a tin cup of warm broth. "You gotta eat," he said gently. "Not for me, for you." She stared at the cup but didn't move. Elijah sighed, ran a hand down his face. "You're not safe. Not while they're looking for you. And I can't protect you if I don't know what the hell's going on." Still nothing. So he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old coin. Mexican silver, tarnished and smooth. He held it out to her. "This was given to me by a man I never met. Died before I could thank him. Left it behind with a note. Give this to someone when you need them to believe you." Tala looked at the coin, then at him. Slowly, she took it, turned it over in her fingers like it might tell her something. Then, for the first time since she arrived, she spoke. They were meeting to talk peace. My uncle, some of the southern chiefs, a colonel from the army. They were going to sign something, make the land shared, hunting rights, safe passage. Her voice was small, but clear, each word heavy with memory. They came dressed like us, painted, spoke enough Apache to fool the guards, but they weren't Apache. They were white men with black teeth and yellow eyes. Soldiers, maybe, maybe not. Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. They killed them, all of them. Shot the colonel, too. Made it look like we did it. And they took a list. What kind of list? Tala looked up at him, eyes hard now. Names of the chiefs who agreed to the treaty, so they could kill them next. She reached into her shawl and pulled out a scrap of cloth, folded and worn. Sewn into the hem was a strip of parchment, blood-stained but dry. I took it, ran before they saw. My uncle told me to run, said to find someone I could trust. She held it out to him. I think it's you. That night the wind carried smoke, not the kind that choked or burned, but the kind that whispered. Elijah stood at the edge of his fence line, staring out toward the far mesas, where a thin column of firelight danced against the stars. A signal. It rose in short bursts, then long, deliberate pauses. Tala stood beside him, wrapped in her blanket, lips moving without sound as she counted the rhythm. He didn't know the code, but he didn't need to. The message was clear enough. They were still out there, watching, waiting. Tala pointed to the south, where another faint glow flickered low against the hills. Then another, farther west. 3 fires now, 3 voices in the dark. Elijah followed her hand and nodded slowly. They're answering back, he said. Ain't they? She didn't smile, but something in her face softened. They know I'm alive. Elijah glanced toward the barn, then the horizon again. He could feel the air shifting, quieter, colder, like the land itself was holding its breath. "We light one," he said. "How many'll come?" Tala looked up at him. "All of them." He didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he walked to the shed, grabbed a pitchfork and a bucket of pitch, and started gathering kindling. Tala followed in silence, her bare feet quiet in the dirt. They built the fire at the ridge behind the barn, high ground where it could be seen for miles. Elijah stacked the logs tight and tall, the way his pa used to for winter blazes. He soaked the base with pitch, then struck a match against the heel of his boot. The fire caught fast. Flames danced up like spirits waking from sleep. Tala knelt beside it, her hands folded in her lap, eyes reflecting the glow. "They'll ride tonight," she said. "Some fast, some slow, some already halfway here." "You think they'll make it in time?" "I think they'll die trying." Elijah sat beside her, watching the sparks rise into the night like fireflies. He thought about Kincaid's threats, about the way those riders had circled his barn in silence, about how many men would come with badges and clean boots and hollow smiles once they realized the girl hadn't vanished into the desert. He thought about the list sewn into her shawl, the names written in a dying man's hand, the kind of names that could stop a war or start another. The fire snapped and cracked, sending a wave of warmth across the ridge. Down below, more fires answered, 5 now, maybe 6. All across the horizon, tiny pulses of hope and warning. "Your people," Elijah said, voice low. "They coming for you?" Tala shook her head. "They're coming for truth." And in that moment, watching the flames carry her message into the stars, Elijah understood what it meant to take a side. Not against men, but against silence. They came at dawn, when the light was low and the shadows long. 3 riders this time, no dust cloud, no showy entrance. Just cold silence and spurred leather. Soldiers, not scouts. Men used to kicking down doors and asking questions only after the blood dried. Elijah spotted them from the loft window and stepped down from the barn with his rifle slung casual over his shoulder. Not raised, not hidden. Just there, like a fact too heavy to ignore. Tala stayed inside, watching through the slats. The lead rider wore a lieutenant's stripes, but he didn't carry himself like one. Too stiff, too clean, like he'd earned them on paper, not in battle. The other 2 flanked him without a word. One had a carbine across his chest. The other chewed a matchstick and never blinked. "You, Elijah Briggs?" the lieutenant asked, voice flat as gravel. "That's what it says on the deed." "You've been visited by Marshal Kincaid, I believe." Elijah didn't answer. "We're under orders from Fort Calhoun," the man continued, "to retrieve a fugitive. Young girl, tribal descent, escaped custody following a hostile incident." Elijah tilted his head. Funny. Didn't know the army started chasing children. The lieutenant didn't flinch. "She's considered dangerous. Carries stolen property tied to an ongoing investigation. We're authorized to act with force if necessary." Behind him, the matchstick man spat into the dirt. The one with the carbine shifted his weight. "Now," the lieutenant said, reaching into his coat, "I'm required to offer a warning before escalation." He pulled out a bullet. Just one. Long, brass, polished like a coin. He tossed it underhand, and it landed in the dust at Elijah's feet. "Next one," he said. "Won't be for show." Elijah bent down, picked it up, and rolled it between his fingers. He felt the weight of it, not just metal, but meaning, a promise, an invitation. "Appreciate the courtesy," he said, slipping the round into his vest pocket. "You done now?" The lieutenant nodded once. "We'll be back, and next time, it won't be 3 of us." He turned his horse with practiced precision, and the others followed. No threats, no yelling, just quiet certainty, like death on a schedule. Elijah stood there until the dust settled, watching the trail where they disappeared. Then he looked toward the barn. Tala was there, just a shadow behind the slats, but she'd seen it all. He walked back slow, each step heavier than the last. He didn't speak when he passed her, just placed the bullet gently on the work table beside the oil lamp. Then he lit the lamp and started loading every shell he owned. By nightfall, every tool in his shed had a second purpose. Every door was braced, every window wired. The lines were drawn now, not in chalk or sand, but in steel. It started with a vibration, barely there at first, just a tremble in the floorboards beneath Elijah's boots, so faint it could have been the wind. But he knew better. A man who's lived through 3 border skirmishes and a cattle stampede doesn't mistake thunder for hooves. He stepped outside, shotgun in hand, heart already beating like a war drum. The night was cloudless, the stars sharp and watching. The kind of night you'd pray to if you had any gods left. The sound grew, distant at first, then rising, steady and low, like rolling earth. Not galloping, not wild, disciplined, unified. A rhythm no outlaw gang could match. And soon, the hills started moving. Elijah stood at the edge of his porch, staring out into the black beyond the pasture, and they appeared, first as shadows, then as silhouettes, then as warriors. Dozens. No, hundreds. Apache. They came on horseback, silent but unmistakable, riding in long, even rows. No shouting, no war cries, just presence. A force of nature dressed in feathers, hide, and resolve. The kind of force that didn't ask permission, the kind that answered calls no white man could hear. Tala stepped onto the porch beside him, barefoot, her blanket trailing behind her like a tail of smoke. She didn't say anything, just stared. They weren't coming for blood. Not yet. They were coming for her. The lead rider broke formation, a tall man with braided gray hair and eyes like obsidian. He dismounted without a word and walked through the tall grass like it bowed to him. Elijah lowered his shotgun but didn't move. The man stopped a few paces away, looked at Elijah. Then Tala. She stepped down from the porch and walked to him. He dropped to one knee and touched her face, his hand trembling just once. Then he spoke. Not to Elijah, not to her, but to the riders behind him. Words Elijah didn't understand, but their meaning was clear. A prayer, a welcome, maybe a warning. The warriors fanned out, surrounding the ranch, not closing in, but forming a wall, a line that no bullet would pass without consequence. Their eyes burned not with rage, but readiness. Elijah swallowed hard. He wasn't afraid, not of them. He was afraid of what it meant. Because no one summoned 200 Apache warriors to stand guard at a white man's barn unless the truth they protected was too big to bury. Tala turned back toward him and nodded just once. They had come, and they weren't leaving. They built the circle just before sunrise. No torches, no banners, just men on horseback, still as statues, forming a ring around Elijah's barn. 200 warriors, maybe more, each one watching, waiting. The kind of silence that didn't ask for permission. The kind that only comes before judgment. Elijah stood in the center, shotgun slung across his back, hands loose at his sides. Tala sat beside the old chief, wrapped in a cloak too large for her, the folds pooling around her like a shroud. She hadn't said a word since the riders arrived, but she didn't look afraid. Not anymore. Chief Ten Feathers stepped forward. His voice was low, but carried like thunder across the circle. "We come not for blood," he said, in English this time. "We come for truth." Elijah nodded once. "Then you came to the right place." They gave him space, a spot at the center of the ring. No podium, no jury, just warriors and sky. He told them everything, about the caravan, the burned wagons, the silence that followed, about Marshal Kincaid and his quiet threats, about the footprints around his barn and the bullet left like a signature on his porch. He didn't try to dress it up, didn't claim to be brave or noble, just a man who saw a child starving and gave her a piece of bread. When he finished, the chief turned to Tala. She stood, shoulders back, and pulled the blood-stained list from her cloak. She handed it to one of the warriors, who read each name aloud in Apache. Each name fell like a drumbeat, slow and solemn. Elijah didn't understand the words, but he could feel them. Every one. When the reading ended, the chief stepped forward again. "These men sought peace," he said. "They trusted the white soldiers. They sent children to speak where war had spoken before." He looked down at Tala, then back at Elijah. "But peace cannot live where truth is hunted like prey. This child carries truth, and this man," he turned now, his voice tightening, "this man gave her shelter when it would have been safer to give her to the fire." A murmur passed through the circle, quiet, reverent. The chief reached into his sash and withdrew a feather bound with red cord. He placed it in Elijah's hand. "This is the sign of the promise," he said. "You stand between our children and the fire now. And if the fire returns, we will meet it together." Elijah closed his hand around the feather. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, surrounded by warriors who had ridden through the night, for a little girl and the truth she carried, Elijah Briggs became something no rancher ever asked to be. A line in the sand, and a verdict carved in bone. That night they built no fires, not one. The stars did all the work, blanketed the sky so thick it looked like God had spilled salt across black velvet. Elijah sat cross-legged in the dirt, his back against the barn wall, shotgun resting beside him, eyes lifted to the sky. Around him, the warriors lay silent. Some sat with bows across their knees. Others leaned against their mounts. But no one slept. Truth had been spoken, but that didn't mean the danger was over. Tala was near the center of the camp, wrapped in her cloak beside Chief Ten Feathers. She hadn't spoken since the ceremony, just stared up at the stars, like she was listening to them, not watching. Elijah felt a shift beside him and turned to find one of the younger braves crouching near. No more than 20, face painted in dark swirls, eyes sharp but curious. The boy held out a wooden bowl of something warm, corn mash and herbs, maybe berries. Elijah took it with a nod and spooned a bite into his mouth. It tasted like earth and firewood. Honest food. "You stayed," the boy said in halting English. "Didn't see a better option," Elijah replied. The boy smiled faintly, then pointed to the sky. "You see that star?" Elijah followed his finger, a bright one, high and still. "That's the warrior's eye," the boy said. "It watches men who choose truth, even when it's hard." Elijah didn't answer, just looked up again and thought about that fire they'd lit 2 nights ago. The one that had summoned an army and changed the shape of his life. Later, when most of the camp had settled into the rhythm of quiet watchfulness, Chief 10 Feathers walked over and eased himself down beside Elijah. He moved slow, like a man who'd been carrying too much for too long. "Do you know what they'll do when they come?" the chief asked. "Burn everything," Elijah said. The chief nodded. "They will come with fire and flags. Say you betrayed your kind. Say we held you hostage. And what will you say?" The old man looked at him, and in the dark, his eyes glinted with something ancient. "We will say nothing. Our silence will be your shield. But silence can only last so long." Elijah leaned back against the barn and exhaled. "Then let them come." The chief placed a hand on his shoulder. "When they do, remember this night, the sky above us, the truth between us, and the people who rode through darkness not to start war, but to stop one." He rose and returned to the fireless camp. Elijah stayed there a while, watching the warrior's eye overhead, burning steady, burning true. It didn't blink, and neither would he. By mid-morning, the sun was high and hot enough to peel paint off the barn. Flies circled the troughs, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called out like a warning. The circle of warriors remained intact, but quieter now. Less like sentries, more like witnesses. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. Tala sat beneath the cottonwood tree, legs crossed, the cloak wrapped around her like armor. The blood-stained strip of parchment lay across her lap, flattened and weighted at each corner by stones. Elijah sat beside her, squinting down at the names. Some were smudged from the run, others darkened with old blood. But the ink still held. The list was short. 9 names. Each written in 2 languages, Apache first, then a rough phonetic English spelling underneath. These were the men who'd agreed to sign the treaty. Men who'd stuck their necks out for peace, who'd believed promises, and brought their families out of hiding to build something better. 4 were already dead. Tala pointed to their names and whispered the place and the fire where they fell. Elijah listened, jaw clenched. Then she pointed to the 6th name. A chill moved through her fingers as she traced the letters. "Nakewa," she said softly. "He's still alive." "You sure?" She nodded. "He's hiding in the black caves, waiting for word." Elijah looked at the others. "What about these 2? Tala hesitated, then pointed to the 7th name. He turned, gave the soldiers safe passage into the canyon. He's why they got close. "Traitor?" She didn't answer, just looked down. And the last name, scrawled at the very bottom, slanted and rushed, made her voice drop to a whisper. "He never showed. Sent no scout. No reply. My uncle said he was wavering." "Wavering or watching?" Elijah asked. Tala didn't know. The parchment fluttered in the wind, delicate as old skin. Elijah leaned back, eyes scanning the hills. "These names mean something," he said. "This isn't just a list. It's a map of the next fire." Tala nodded. "If we don't get this to someone who can stop it, they'll kill the rest before the season turns." She didn't cry. Not anymore. That part of her had burned out in the ashes of her caravan. Elijah stood and folded the parchment with care, tucking it into a leather pouch he strapped around his neck. Then he turned to the chief, who had been listening from the shadows, his face carved from stone. "We need to ride," Elijah said. "Fort Richardson. Someone there will listen." The chief stared at the horizon. "They will try to kill you." Elijah nodded. "They've already tried." The chief turned to his warriors and barked a command. Horses were saddled, weapons checked. Tala was lifted onto a painted mare by a young brave with steady hands. As Elijah mounted, he felt the list press against his chest like a second heartbeat. Names, just ink and paper. But behind every letter, a grave waiting to be filled. They saw the dust first, a long, low smear of brown crawling over the eastern ridge, too thick for cattle, too slow for wind. Elijah shaded his eyes and counted the silhouettes. At least 20 riders, soldiers, rifles glinting in the early light like teeth in a wolf's grin. They came in formation, tight and purposeful, led by a man in a black duster with silver bars on his collar. Not Kincaid, someone higher, a man with authority written into every movement. Behind him rode 2 men Elijah recognized from the porch visit, the ones who'd left a bullet as a calling card. Tala stood at his side, her hands clenched around the saddle horn of her borrowed horse. Her jaw was tight, her eyes fixed. The wind tugged at her cloak, like it wanted to pull her away from the coming violence, but she didn't move. The Apache warriors were already in position, spread wide across the yard and ridgeline, forming a wall without words. No battle cries, no warnings, just presence. The soldiers stopped 30 paces out. The lead officer raised one hand, and the line behind him did the same. No weapons drawn yet. "I am Colonel Willard Price," the officer called. "We're here under direct order from the territorial governor to retrieve a fugitive and secure stolen government documents." Elijah stepped forward, just enough to make it clear who they'd have to go through. "She's not a fugitive," he said. "She's a witness, and what she's carrying ain't stolen. It's evidence." Colonel Price's face didn't move, not an inch. "You are harboring a known accomplice to the murder of Colonel Addison Morrison, and you're interfering with an active investigation. Step aside." Elijah pulled the leather pouch from his coat and held it high. "You want it? Then listen close." He opened it and withdrew the folded parchment, now worn thin and stained with sweat and time. "This is a list of tribal leaders who agreed to Morrison's peace terms. 4 are already dead. One's hiding. One betrayed the others. And Morrison? He didn't die in an ambush. He was executed. By your own." Murmurs flickered among the soldiers like sparks near dry grass. Colonel Price's hand hovered near his belt, not quite touching the pistol, but close enough. "You don't know what you're doing," Price said. "No," Elijah said. "You don't know who's watching." He stepped aside just enough for the soldiers to see the ridgeline. All of it. Every Apache warrior now visible. Every bow drawn. Every rifle steadied. 200 eyes staring down barrels. 200 reasons not to fire. The colonel's face changed. just a crack in the mask, enough to see the fear underneath. Tala rode forward, cloak billowing behind her, voice rising like a bell in the morning air. You kill us now. The truth still lives. But if you listen, we all live to tell it. For a long moment, no one moved. Not the soldiers, not the warriors. Then a single bird cried out over the canyon, and the standoff held. The soldiers left by noon. Not a shot fired, not a word more spoken. Just turned their horses and rode back the way they came, slow, uncertain, like men who'd seen something holy and didn't know what to do with it. Elijah watched them vanish into the horizon, the dust from their retreat mingling with the heat rising off the earth. He didn't move until the last silhouette dropped beneath the ridge. Only then did he exhale. The Apache warriors began to peel away in silence, one by one, disappearing into the scrub and stone like ghosts returning to the land. No cheers, no handshakes, just a quiet nod of recognition between fighters who had stared death in the face and chosen, for once, to hold their fire. Chief Ten Feathers remained behind with Tala, his hand resting on her shoulder as they stood beneath the cottonwood where her story had first been laid bare. He said nothing, but Elijah could see the pride in his eyes, the weight of a people's survival, resting in the bones of a little girl who had refused to die quietly. She rode out that evening with a small escort, the list tucked safe in a leather pouch beside her heart. Her mission wasn't over. Fort Richardson still needed the truth. The treaty still needed signatures. The names of the dead still needed to be spoken aloud before they vanished with the wind. Before she left, she approached Elijah, a bundle in her arms. "I don't have much," she said, her voice no longer hollow. "But I want you to have this." She held out a small satchel made of worn buffalo hide, stitched with white beads and red thread. Inside was the silver coin Elijah had given her, now polished and shining. "You believed me before anyone else," she said. "That makes you part of this story." He took it gently, his throat too tight to speak. Tala smiled, small, tired, but real. Then she mounted her horse and rode into the dusk, dust curling behind her like a ribbon of smoke. Days passed. Marshal Kincaid disappeared from the territory. Rumors said he'd been arrested. Others claimed he vanished into Mexico with a bounty on his head. Either way, he was never seen again. The governor received the list, and with it, Morrison's letter. Testimonies followed. Investigations opened. The war they were waiting for never came. And Elijah Briggs, just a rancher who once gave a starving girl a bowl of stew, became the first white man invited to speak before the Apache Council as a friend. Not a hero, not a savior, just a man who chose mercy when it would have been easier to turn away. Because sometimes the war ends not with blood or banners, but with a single act of kindness and the courage of a girl who refused to stay silent.